Defense forces of Ukraine struck two important Russian occupier targets. Ukrainian defenders also hit two aircraft in temporarily occupied Crimea. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine reported this. It is reported that the most important targets of the Russian aggressor have been hit. Specifically, in an effort to reduce the enemy's offensive potential and complicate the supply of fuel and ammunition to the occupying forces' military units, on the night of September 23, units of the missile and artillery forces and the Unmanned Systems Forces of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, in cooperation with other units of the defense forces, struck a linear production control station in the Bryansk region of the Russian Federation. The General Staff explained that LPDS-8N is part of the LPDS-8N, LPDS Steel Horse main oil pipeline complex. The facility is of strategic importance for supplying petroleum products to the Russian occupation army. A hit to the pump and compressor station, followed by a fire in the area, has been confirmed. A second strike by Ukrainian Armed Forces Unmanned Systems Forces units on the Samara Linear Production Control Station in Russia's Samara Oblast has also been confirmed. This production station blends high and low sulfur crude oil from various fields to produce Urals, the export grade of crude oil. It is noted that the extent of the damage is being clarified. Additionally, hits on two aircraft at the Bucha military airfield in the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea were confirmed. Enemy weapons struck units of the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense of Ukraine. The results and extent of the damage are being clarified, the General Staff added. As a reminder, the Ukrainian Defense Forces struck a Russian Army drone distribution center and ammunition depot in the temporarily occupied territories.
The success of the Ukrainian counter-offensive in Sumy Oblast, where the defense forces drove the Russians out of several villages over the summer, deprives Russia of some of its bargaining chips in any hypothetical peace negotiations, according to the New York Times. In a lengthy article, the publication tells the story of the liberation of the village of Kindratovka, located less than 20 kilometers north of Sumy. Modest achievements that matter greatly to Kiev. The successful Ukrainian counterattack in the Sumy region, bordering Russia, is a rare turnaround on a battlefield dominated by Moscow's forces, the publication states. American journalists note that amid the constant advance of the Russian army, which seizes hundreds of square kilometers of Ukrainian territory every month, the recapture of even small areas of the Sumy region helps Ukraine counter Moscow's narrative of Kyiv's inability to stop the Russian offensive. Specifically in the Sumy region, the Russian offensive has failed so badly that the Russian command has finally given up on it and transferred its main forces from there to the Donbass. However, another aspect is even more important. As the New York Times notes, Moscow previously proposed exchanging the captured parts of Sumy Oblast for the rest of Donbass territory as part of a peace agreement. US President Donald Trump appears to have supported this idea, despite the obvious disproportionate nature of such an exchange. However, Ukraine's achievements near Sumy weaken Russia's negotiating position. Why should we exchange territories if we can get them back, explains Maxim Skripchenko, president of the Kyiv-based Center for Transatlantic Dialogue. At the same time, the strategic situation for the defense forces remains extremely dire. The NYT writes, citing the aggressor's significant advantage in infantry numbers and firepower. Not only Russian drones, but also Russian guided bombs pose a problem for Ukrainian forces, including in the Sumy region. Besides creating real problems for the Ukrainian military, Russia's tactic of bombing every inch of land leads to the complete destruction of the settlements being fought over. The aforementioned village of Kindratovka was reduced to rubble after its liberation. Sumy resident Natalia Biletchenko, interviewed by the authors of this publication, recalled how a colleague rejoiced at the liberation of Kindratovka, her home village. However, this joy was overshadowed by the fact that her home was destroyed. Of course, she was happy, but at the same time she was homeless, without anything, the woman said. Ukrainian forces in Sumy successfully exploit methodical maneuver warfare, pressing forward settlement by settlement to turn Russian positions into manageable targets. Rather than trading lives in costly frontal fights, Ukrainian commanders isolate enemy detachments, sever their supply lines, and then tighten the noose until those positions become untenable. Relentless air and drone strikes have exposed Russian units, leaving many undersupplied and unrotated for several weeks, reports Euromaidan Press media outlet. By bypassing strongpoints and collapsing salients piece by piece, Ukraine has been able to push north of Kindrativka and even probe back into Kursk, while turning both sides of the border into a flexible battlefield. Another push north from Andriivka led to Oleksiivka being cut off on three sides, and the Russians there facing an increasingly dangerous situation. The encirclement is the result of coordinated Ukrainian maneuver, constant fire control and persistent pressure, with Ukrainian units now executing flanking attacks to close lateral routes. At the same time, Ukrainian drone units pummel Russian concentrations and roads in the area with hundreds of strikes. This denies the Russians any possibility of moving freely and degrades all reinforcement efforts. With only a single usable road into Oleksiivka, bringing supplies, evacuating casualties, or rotating troops has become effectively impossible, as anyone attempting the approach is detected and struck long before it reaches the outer edge of the settlement. Russian soldiers on the ground now openly warn that Oleksiivka is heading for the same fate as Kindrativka unless the Russian command abandons the position rather than bury more troops there, as they report that the semi-encirclement is rapidly turning into a slaughter. Instead, Russian officers have reacted with frantic redeployments in a bid to break the encirclement, as the exhausted 382nd Separate Infantry Battalion of the 810th Russian Naval Brigade was pushed into action at Kindrativka. Euromaidan Press says, supposed to mount a counterattack and relieve the pocket at Oleksiivka under normal strength, this formation would field roughly 1,000 soldiers, but under the current conditions, it only musters close to 500. Notably, a large number of these are reportedly new mobilized, poorly trained and badly equipped soldiers thrown in just to bring the battalion up to a higher combat readiness on paper. Russian sources confirm all combat-effective reserves have been redeployed to Pokrovsk, leaving only second-tier and understrength units for the task of preventing a full-on collapse. One Russian officer even reported they receive only older people, marginals, and simply not combat-ready recruits in poor physical condition. He added that to prevent desertion or the shooting of officers, they are constantly watched by military police and are only issued weapons right before combat missions with ammunition limited to 2 magazines each. The attempted rushed countermeasure to attack Kindrativka to relieve pressure at Oleksiivka was predictable and fated to fail. Euromaidan Press says replacements arrived under fire, becoming immediate targets for Ukrainian drone and artillery assets, with exhausted Russian units unable to form coherent assault echelons. Overall, with the Ukrainians maintaining pressure by holding fire control over the approaches, continuing daily drone strikes, and refusing to be lured into costly frontal battles, Oleksiivka's fate will mirror earlier Russian collapses in the area. Ukraine's advantage is decisive, with its troops being on the offensive and able to choose when and where to fight.